Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another installment in our Reviewed and Ranked series. We are still making our way through the free unlockable characters that are available within the base game, and that of course brings us to a very interesting character in the roster, and that is the Master of Magnetism himself, Magneto. Now, Magneto has a lot of things to unpack and discuss, especially because he feels really weird as a character, with both how he executes his attacks and abilities, as well as how those abilities in and of themselves work. So hopefully this helps you understand a little bit more about the complexities of the character, and of course we will be placing him in a ranking as well as soon as we are finished with this breakdown. As we get started, make sure to check and see if you are subscribed. If you are not, go ahead and fix that for me real quick, and your reward will be daily variety content coming through your way. And if you find today's video helpful, interesting, and or enjoyable, make sure that you hit that like button. So first off, we need to talk about Magneto's team building implications. And he has a decent amount of synergies available in that regard. He has 6 different synergies through other members of the team. He has 2 strength synergies with X-Men and anti-heroes. He has a vitality synergy with villains. He has a mastery synergy with forces of nature. He has a defense synergy with heavy metal, and he has a resilience synergy with first-class X-Men. I think that that's one of the first that we've seen in that particular class, and there will be others that will fall into that category as we continue down the road. The obvious benefits, at least from my own personal experience and preference, is of course with those 2 strength synergies and the mastery synergy there, as that will really allow you to bolster the power of your team, both in terms of how hard you hit with your standard attacks, as well as the follow-ups that you will have access to with those team synergy attacks, or the battle synergy attacks as you employ those. We'll now pivot over and talk a little bit about the base abilities that are in Magneto's kit. And the first thing to note there is, of course, the standard hit combo that he possesses, which has 3 different hits to it. It actually has a similar, if not identical, animation to the attacks that we saw from Doctor Strange. And though the attacks do make physical contact with the opponents, they do have a decent amount of forward range to them as well. So you don't have to be right on top of your opponents in order to land those strikes, as you can get nice impact from those standard hits as you layer in to your opponents. Now, it is a bit unfortunate that he only has those 3 hits in his combo, and they are decent at what they do, but if you're looking for sheer amount of hits and continuing to chain many different attacks from a combo into opponents, then Magneto's not really going to be your best option. Magneto's heavy attack is very unique, and it doesn't deal a whole lot of damage, but what it will do is pull opponents out in front of you into the same general area while drawing them back away from you. And this is particularly useful against grunt type opponents that do not have a ranged type ability to them, as it will discourage them from countering into you as they are being sucked off in a completely different direction. This also allows you and other members of your team to follow up a little bit more concisely, because it will draw those opponents into one localized area. It works interesting, and you can kind of spam the attack to really help gather opponents together, but at the same time it is a very lengthy heavy attack, so it's not the best option when it comes to heavy attack and heavy attack damage. So again, the attack is very unique, but it is a far cry from being one of the best heavy attacks in the cast. Magneto does have a flight capacity, and that's, like any other flying character in the game, is activated by hitting the jump button a second time when the character is already airborne. And as with all other flight abilities in the game, this does drain into your energy point reserves, so make sure that you are only using this ability when it is useful to you. And traversing through the environment that you're playing in is not a good area to use that, because you do not get any sort of movement buff. So if you're trying to move faster, go with a teleporting character. Don't use a character like Magneto and their flight, because when you get into an actual round of combat, you're going to find that you don't have the option of using a lot of your more powerful attacks, and that is especially true in Magneto's case. Magneto has a falling aerial that I wouldn't say is amazing, but it does kind of fit what he goes for. He sends a couple of magnetic pulse orbs down to the ground, and they do make contact with opponents and give them that degree of knockback, provided that they're, the smaller grunt type characters, and they deal decent damage as well. The one kind of downside for this is it's not an attack that you can use repeatedly on your way down, and it does not home onto opponents that are in the area either. So it's not really the best attack that Magneto has at his disposal. And additionally, you're not going to find a whole lot of times where you would be put in a position where you would be likely to use the falling aerial, mainly due to the fact that he doesn't have any abilities that put him in that type of a position to begin with. So you probably won't use it, but know that it goes out a decent way ahead of him as he is falling down, if you do find yourself in a place where you can use this attack. And Magneto's block and dodge animation, his block is actually very unique, as he will conjure up a protective field around him and put himself in kind of a bubble or a sphere of that magnetic protective energy. And that just serves as a block. Of course, it does not nullify incoming attacks from opponents. You will still take some chip damage through it. And instead of rolling or doing anything else, he does kind of glide forward as he dodges away from incoming attacks, which fits with Magneto's character. I mean, he floats around all over the place anyway, so it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for him to roll. And since he doesn't have any dilation type abilities with being a Magnet Master, he doesn't have the ability to blink in and out or anything else of that sort. So this does fit with how Magneto would go about moving through the battlefield. We can now make the transition over to talk about Magneto's abilities. And the first one, I disagree with how it is described. It's the Fatal Attraction, and the description indicates that this is a timed gravity bomb that will draw your opponents in before exploding. And though that is the way that this ability works in his boss fights when you are fighting against Magneto, this ability doesn't really work that way when you are controlling the character. Instead, it is still a gravity field, but as you hold down that button, it will draw the opponents in, and upon releasing the button, you have the larger concussive blast. It is a fairly weak gravity field in comparison with other characters in the cast, and there's not a lot of them that have it, but this is definitely the lower end of that spectrum. There's just not a lot of power behind it, and it is handy if it draws a bunch of opponents in. The difficulty with this is it takes place right in front of Magneto. You can't choose to place this somewhere else, and upon releasing that button is when it detonates, so you can't set this up as a trap, go off and do a couple of other attacks and then come back. It's really kind of lackluster, and I don't like this ability because it locks you into it until you choose to release that button. It does have its uses, but all in all, I'm really not impressed, especially because there are other characters in this game that accomplish this in a lot better of a method of doing so. Talking about the rest of the attack, though, it has the energy attack type and the burst synergy trait, and possesses decent stats in terms of damage and what it's capable of dealing with a C classification to damage, stagger damage dealt, and energy points consumed. And as you rank up all of Magneto's abilities, they benefit from having a reduced energy point cost, an increase to the attack damage, an increase to the damage done to the opponent's stagger gauge, and finally that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Magneto's second ability is a lot better in terms of what it brings to the table and greatly increases Magneto's range. This is the Deadly Debris, and this is where Magneto will gather debris from the area and hurl it towards enemies that are out in front of him. You can press this button repeatedly to continue attacking, and you can also spin around in 360 degrees of motion to really hit into your opponents, though I wouldn't recommend doing that, but rather focusing in on your opponents. What could be potentially really good to do with Magneto is throw out one of his heavy attacks and then chain the Deadly Debris into it, because as your opponents are focused into a central channel, they will then be opened up to this Deadly Debris fire that comes across. And it looks like it's just a bunch of chunks of rocks and other things, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense in Magneto's realm of abilities since he's magnetism and not earth manipulation. But it is generally understood that he is either using bits of iron and other magnetic material that is in that ground, or ripping up structures that are reinforced with rebar and other metallic items on the inside to gather together those orbs and hurl them out across the battlefield into the opponents. So it could be contrived as lazy, but you see this used by Magneto fairly frequently, especially in metropolitan type areas. So there are certainly areas of the game that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but for the most part, it's what you have. This ability has the melee attack type and the rapid fire synergy trait, and it's not the greatest option in terms of dealing stagger damage, as it has an E classification there, but has a better rating for standard damage and energy points consumed, having a C classification to both of those areas. Magneto's third ability is the magnetic pulse. This is an attack that we've seen from a couple of different characters in the roster, and it is a proximity attack that takes place in Magneto's immediate vicinity, where he will attack in a 360-degree area around himself with a wave of force that pushes enemies backwards. This attack is fairly good in terms of the area that it covers, and it's also one of his quicker abilities to be executed. So you'll probably see Magneto using this attack a lot, especially when he's left to his own devices as the computer controls him on the members of your team. And apart from that, it's not crazy. There are certainly better abilities, and Magneto has one other ability specifically that we'll talk about in a minute that has a much higher damage potential, but it's a decent option for him and fits the aesthetic of his character. This ability has the energy attack type and the bash synergy trait, and possesses those C ratings to damage, stagger damage dealt, as well as energy points consumed. And Magneto's fourth and final ability is the Master of Magnetism, where he will collect 2 large masses of debris and then attack enemies out in front of him. This will push some of the smaller grunt characters back, and they do meet at a focal point out in front of Magneto where the largest amount of damage is dealt. This is Magneto's best damage dealer, but it is also an incredibly lengthy attack, and it leaves him quite vulnerable while he is carrying this out. So use it sparingly and only when you know for a fact that you are finishing off large groups of enemies or focusing down some of the other opponents that are within that area. This attack has the melee attack type and the bash synergy trait, has a good classification to damage, having that A rating, and has an energy point consumption of C and a decent rating to the stagger damage with that D characteristic. But Magneto's not the character that you will be using to break down stagger gauges and stun bars for your opponents, so don't put him on your team if that's what you're intending to use him for, because it will not go well. Last but not least, we come to Magneto's extreme attack. And this one works actually decently well because it takes up a large area. I think that this is the farthest reaching extreme attack, despite the fact that it only reaches that far at the very end of the attack. He will gather a couple of those spheres of debris, spin them around himself before sending them flying out in 360 degrees around him. And so even if you don't have opponents that are right next to Magneto when this attack is being used, they will still get struck by it, basically regardless of wherever they are, as the debris is flung out across the battlefield. So it has a large area of coverage, of course with the focal point of the attack being right next to Magneto. As those orbs spin around him, they will deal consistent damage to the opponents that are standing right where he is before being flung out. It's not the end of the world if you don't have Magneto exactly where you want him to be when detonating this attack, but he will not move or correct as he carries it out. So it is best to try and make sure that he is centrally located in a group of enemies before this attack is initiated. And it takes about 4.5 seconds before Magneto becomes actionable again, but he has quite a bit of coverage as he is using the attack. so you don't have to worry about immediate retaliation from your opponents. So now that we have looked at Magneto and what he does, it's time for us to determine where he belongs within this list of characters. And he's not great. Like, he's a very cool character in terms of how he works, and he definitely benefits as a crowd control member of your team, but he has a lot of really laggy attacks, and one of his most useful attacks in terms of the deadly debris eats up a lot of his energy points as it's used. As you are rapidly firing it, it just chews through the energy points, and it's unfortunate because that's the attack that really gives him the most amplification to his ranged type abilities. So he definitely falls out of the top half of this tier list, and yes, I mean that takes him out of B tier as well. So what I really think is best placement for Magneto is here at the top of C tier, and I would go as far to place him ahead of Star-Lord by just a small margin, and it's mainly due to the fact that he does have the ability to take his opponents down a notch in terms of creating space for your team, as well as actually deterring returning attacks from the grunt type enemies that are very common. And what it really just comes down to is he doesn't hit hard enough for me to justify placing him any higher on this list. I still think that Star-Lord has the edge over Drax, mainly because of his ability to stun out opponents as they are attacking into him with the electric abilities that he has, but Magneto just has a couple of extra benefits in discouraging retaliation from his opponents, so he takes a very slight lead ahead of Star-Lord into C tier here. But what do you think? Do you agree with my placement of Magneto? Do you think that there's something that I've overlooked or left out with this character? Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. And again, if you've made it this far into the video, make sure that you are subscribed and don't forget to leave a like. So thanks again for your time, everyone, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.